right, thank you very much. I've got my laptop here just to check titles and dates of things. I hope that if anybody has any questions about specific games, I can give a bit more information later. What I'm going to try and do is give a survey of a theme in a genre, and I've got a few examples to highlight, but it'll be mostly just a few pictures, and I'll try and tell a story about something that hasn't been studied before, because it's kind of reading against the grain of a genre of games. Jakub was just asking, is a 2005 game worth even looking at? Let me take you back to a time of legend, sometimes called the 1990s. And I'm going to look at a genre of game which is actually quite hard to label. Sometimes it's called versus beat-em-ups or fighting games. And I'm going to discount side-scrolling beat-em-up games, the kind of Double Dragon, Bad Dudes style of game, even though there's plenty of interesting material there from my point of view, looking at ancient Greece and Rome. For example, anybody who's played Altered Beast might have noticed that at the beginning, your character rises from a grave. Rise from your grave is a famous meme, and it's the grave of a Roman centurion. So he's a classical historical character in a sense. But if you're interested in authenticity, then you should probably look away for the duration of this talk, because I'm particularly interested in the idea of ancient Greece and Rome when it's become the property of an audience, and I'm talking about games makers as well as games consumers and players, who haven't got the classical education which constrains them to seeing this material in a certain way. I'm particularly interested in how an idea migrates from one cultural context to another and massively transforms in the process. So I'll mostly be talking about a style of game in which there are certain defining, really successful examples, and then there's this kind of backlog, or I'm going to call them side clones of close imitations, which establish it as a genre-defining game, if you see what I mean. It might be argued that looking for the kind of thing I'm talking about in the kind of game that I'm looking at is not the best place to look. In fact, there are even versus beat-em-up games which are themed on classical antiquity. There's one called Mythic Blades. There are various other examples. Gods of Rome 2015 on mobile devices, very popular. But I'm even going to discount those. What I want to look at is a historical theme, a historical culture, or a bunch of stereotypes or expectations which are appearing in not in a central way for the audience, but in a decentered, a tangential way. And to my mind, that's the most revealing way that they could possibly appear, because they're kind of leaching out of the cultural fabric. They're representing a more generalized expectation for what these things are and what they're for and what makes them entertaining. But I'm going to start with a few simple thoughts and then move on to the examples. So you might notice there's an image on the title card there, title screen, which is from a game called Knuckleheads, and it's one of many, many Street Fighter II side clones, and the building in the background is definitely the Parthenon, and for some reason, the Greek character, I think his name is Vlad Laika or something like that, who's a hunchback who wields a giant metal hammer, and was born in Athens, apparently. Let's not investigate too closely what that all means, but his background, his stage, is the Parthenon, and surrounding the Parthenon is a crowd of apparently ancient people, or at least reenactors or something, a crowd of ancient Greeks, which makes no sense in terms of the plot, but it adds a sort of classical authenticity, as does the ruined condition of that building, which would otherwise be lacking. So if we look at a few very simple thoughts about what these games are about. Versus fighting games are about a motley crew. They're about a series of characters. Usually each one has a stage. And these characters and these sceneries are varied, and they are usually very colorful. And there's an impulse to have a kind of tourism to the game experience. Most of these began as arcade platform games, so they're about a quick hit, rapid turnover, lots of action. And so they can be formulaic. There are certain expectations that anybody who's played such a game will immediately become familiar with. They're cumulative in that there's that sense of progress which is essential for an engaged playing experience. They are scenic. This is almost the same thing. The more you play, the more you can see. You're given further opportunities to see the pixel art and to see the thematic content. And of course, they're beatable. So every culture in the game has to be a potential notch on your on your belt, shall we say. It's about the end point. And invariably the end boss of the game is somehow exceptional. They have a science fiction or a supernatural or some other theme that sets them apart from the geography of the world in which you're notionally exploring. So let me go on to some thoughts on how ancient Greece and Rome might creep sideways into this genre. It could be the setting, and I've mentioned a few examples of games which are set in antiquity in some sense. It's usually Greek mythology. There's one interesting example called Mighty Warriors, Ave Caesar Morituri Te Salutant, from 1992, and that's set in ancient Rome, and it has a Greek warrior, a Roman warrior, an Egyptian warrior, a German warrior, and so on. There are some examples like that, but mostly I'm going to be talking about the second two vectors on this slide. The roster, the characters, and I've put little speech bubbles there to show you that you're basically looking at a character design, some moves, and a tiny bit of dialogue, and that's your characterization. It's a quick hit, like I said. And finally, the stages, theme music, and especially the visuals. So most of the archaeology, such as it is, of these games is a simple backdrop, one image, which is going to scroll back and forth and perhaps be slightly animated as you go on. Let me give you some examples then, and we'll see where this goes. The first thought is something that was, I'm never going to see this again the same way after Florence's presentation yesterday. Video game maps are a totally fascinating phenomenon. Every genre has its expectations. And I've been thinking about this in a bit more detail since yesterday. This type of map, this is an entirely impressionistic and much more detailed one than you would normally get. This is an example of the kind of thing that you see from classical antiquity in a world map from a versus fighting game. And I think it would be similar for a racing game with a worldwide setting, or certain platformers. Castlevania springs to mind. The idea of or in Alex Kidd in Miracle World, there are certain games which had a sense of progression indicated by icons appearing on a map or disappearing. And I've used this word on this slide, iconized. I think iconization is a useful concept here, that the way that ancient Greece and ancient Rome and other cultures like that make their way into a style of game like the Versus arcade fighting game from the 1990s, is through a simplification and a kind of a hot button approach, which means that any kind of familiar hook is immediately the thing you go for. So on this image, I've got Stonehenge and Atlantis, wherever that might be. These are as common ancient settings as the pyramids. Troy is actually quite a rarity, but I'm throwing it in there because the Trojan War is a staple of Greek myth in the popular imagination. And I think the top two in the middle there, Colosseum and Parthenon, are the most essential. I've just got a couple of examples from games now, so let's go on. The top left instance is something from the Street Fighter franchise. Top right, we have a character from Mortal Kombat, Motaro, or I think it's probably pronounced Motaro. We have Tekken in the bottom left, and then Killer Instinct in the bottom right, the 2013 reboot. This is just to show you that if a franchise goes on long enough, the chances are that somewhere around the third or maybe later iteration, they'll start to bring in classical antiquity, which means that even if the original setting of the game had nothing to do with it, you might start reaching into that well at a certain point, for better or worse. The image in the top left, by the way, has been pointed out as a direct copy, including the moving cats, of a scene in the 1972 movie Way of the Dragon. So you should imagine Chuck Norris on the scene. I'm going to linger on this one briefly because it deserves special mention. Street Fighter III's Third Strike. This is the background stage of the final boss, who is somehow a representation of world elites, and he's modeled after a Greek god, and the background has some temples, some pointless fires on sticks, a big dome, and a bireme, I think, an ancient Greek ship, just to give that classical dimension to his character. Okay, and this is an example of a Street Fighter II imitation featuring Notorious, who is an Italian character of some kind. He's clearly modelled on the wrestler Bruiser. What is it? Bruiser Brody, something Brody. He's got two nice backgrounds here. In the first game, it's pixel art. It's the Trevi Fountain on the right-hand side. It's a rendered photo of the Colosseum, and there's not a whole lot more to show you. I'm going to finish with this slide, which I'm going to call this dumpster diving. I think you get the real dirt on how a culture looks to a non-educated, a non-classically trained audience, I should say. When you look at the remnants and the trivia. So I've mentioned this idea of side clones. I would say that all of these are Mortal Kombat influenced. The top left is a game that was cancelled. It was going to be on the Jaguar. It's got a characteristic blend of relatively high-resolution flat stuff and then really low-resolution moving stuff. The man's face in the background, I don't know who that is. I'm trying to find it out. Probably the producer of the game. I think he was wanting to be another John Romero, putting himself in the game. Thea Realm Fighters never saw the light of day. Incidentally, this is from a magazine article, and that's a really important resource. So when we were hearing about the amazing game on the Vixen, I was reminded of what an essential resource it is that people digitize ephemeral content like magazines and flyers. Anyway, the last three images, I want to tell you about another subcategory of perhaps less glamorous but more, in my view, insightful, classical-influenced games, and that is the softcore pornography versus beat 'em up. There's very few of them, but the first one was called Strip Fighter 2, and it was on it was a bootleg game from the early 90s on the TurboGrafx 16, and it featured a character called Medusa who fought with her hair and had a classical-themed background with columns and a broken statue and things in it. And I note that only in passing because the other examples of this very small genre are all also classically influenced. In the top right there, Catfight, one of many contestants for the worst game ever, was made by Atlantean Interactive, which was a front for, or a temporary brand for Vivid Entertainment, which is a pornography company. And it's really bad, but there's a picture of the Parthenon in the background again. And rather like in the Tekken first game. And the game Bikini Karate Babes is much as you would imagine and much as it looks on this static image. Really, really terrible. But that's a statue of Venus in the background. And I don't know if you can tell, but the characters are Venus and Aphrodite brawling on the screen. There was a sequel. It was that good. Even better graphics. And notice this is a 2011 game. Bikini Karate Babes 2, Warriors of Elysia. And it has a Mortal Kombat style plot in which a supernatural being has gathered warriors from different realms of the cosmos to fight against one another. But I will finish there and hopefully have given you something of the flavor, the distinctive, pungent flavor of classical antiquity in this unexpected place, 1990s versus beat-em-ups. And I'll be happy to discuss it further if there's an opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dunstan. There is actually time for questions. So, who wants to know more? You want to throw? You throw. Who wants to know about Bikini Karate Babes? There. Nice.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask about. It's not exactly. Oh, it's a microphone. I didn't. I've only arrived at lunch. It's not exactly about 90s ones, but I was wondering. So I know that the main character from Rise, Son of Rome,
Yes.
appears in Sony All-Star, their Smash Brothers sort of side clone. Does he get a stage? Do you know? Is there like can you basically see Sonic fighting in the Colosseum?
I didn't know he was in that.
I think
That's
he is.
fascinating.
Am I right? Or was that something that was suggested and then dropped?
You just reminded me, I forgot to mention one character who wasn't in any of my pictures, but is also from a major beat-em-up franchise. This is Sophitia Alexandra from SoulCalibur. She's been in every game since the first one in 1999, and she's going to be in the next one that's out in 10 days. And she definitely always gets a stage. But no, your example, I have to look that up, because I didn't know that... What's the name of the protagonist in Rise? Well, that guy.
Rysius?
Anyway. Sorry?
I don't know. I just said
Yeah,
Rysius.
Stabius, Maximus.
Yeah, something like
yeah.
that.
So I will definitely be online looking that up as soon as I finish talking.
I have a feeling like I've seen a GIF of him sword fighting with Sonic, and that was from a trailer.
With Sonic, right?
Because Sonic is the lead character, the way Mario's the lead for Smash Bros. So.
Right. Okay. I'll have to. That will be a T-shirt of mine. I'm sure it's before long. Thank you.
Other questions? Nice.
Great, Dunstan, thank you very much. It's not so much a question as I was really intrigued about who that guy in the background might be, because it started me thinking about references that you get. And so I've just been doing a quick bit of Googling, and I theorise it's Daniel Pesina who plays Johnny Cage in the Mortal Kombat series, looking at his photo.
Really?
Because he was connected to that franchise, says Wikipedia.
Really?
Yes,
Oh,
really.
fantastic.
I'll show you the photos later. But
Oh,
this
well,
leads me to my question about have you, because a lot of this stuff strikes me as consciously tongue-in-cheek, and have you spotted in your surveys other things that might be called self-referencing in terms of individuals who've posited themselves within the games, stuff that's meant to be there for perhaps the more discerning gamer who likes their pop cultural references?
That's interesting. I've generally found a disappointing lack of irony in this. We're looking at this stuff, apart from the obvious direct parody that I mentioned. But so there's a weird fascination in watching the interviews with the actresses who were in Bikini Karate Babes and its sequel, because they are trying to sell the game, in a very professional way, but they're also trying to sell it as a feminist type of game, because all the characters are female. This case is often made, and the fact is, it's been pointed out early in this conference that there's nothing inherently, there's no inherent political position in the content. You rely on the meta stuff and the epi stuff to interpret. So, it is a very interesting question. If anybody comes up with examples of people like really kind of enjoying participation in this as a kind of a bit of fun, then I'd love to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll have to cut the discussion for now, and then we'll come back. Now I would like a round of applause for Dunstan.